Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rabbi Gadi and Eve, for inviting me to come and talk about this subject of psychedelics, which I'm definitely very passionate about. So before I get into it, I'll kind of discuss what I'd like to communicate overall today. First, it's about the nature and historical context of what psychedelics are. And then I'll go more into the healing capacity of psychedelics and how they're being used in clinical applications currently. And then I'll take a deeper dive into the nature of the mystical experience that often accompanies psychedelic sessions and how that relates to our understanding of mysticism from a Jewish perspective. And then I'll conclude by trying to get a better understanding of how Judaism has influenced psychedelics. So before I get into all the weeds, I'll kind of find something else. I'll kind of discuss what sparked my interest in psychedelics in the first place. And it came sort of while I was doing my master's in computational biology, and I felt like I wanted to do research that was more relevant to people's lives directly. And so when I finished that, I found out about this study going on in Arizona that was for OCD patients. I actually found out about it from a comedian who has this whole comedy routine about how psychedelic mushrooms, cured his OCD. And so I found this study and reached out to the psychiatrist who was running it, and I worked on it with him last year. And so I'd like to show you just a short video from the Netflix docuseries How to Change Your Mind, which goes through a session of an individual's psilocybin therapy intervention, and shows how it helped him gain a new perspective and cure his OCD in many ways. So,
can you unmute?
see great information about psychedelics. So to understand how we got here, I want to take you through a little ride through the evolution of psychedelics throughout history. So this first wave of psychedelic use by indigenous cultures has been going on for millennia. And as you can see here, at the bottom right, this is a cave painting from Algeria about 9,000 years ago. That depicts a sort of chimeric animal that's a mouse with a bee together that has mushrooms along its torso and along its arm. And that's said to be a vision that a shaman had who was leading psychedelic mushroom ceremonies. And over here on the upper right is Maria Sabina, who kind of bridged the indigenous use of psychedelics with our modern Western use. So she was from the Mazatec tribe in Mexico, and she was the first to allow in Westerners like Gordon Lawson to take mushrooms. He then subsequently wrote about it in Life magazine in 1957. This led to a lot of hippies kind of coming to their town and ultimately led her to be ostracized because the village became overrun by Westerners. So now we'll get more into the second wave of psychedelic use, which is kind of led by this figure in the bottom right, Timothy Leary, you may be familiar with, who first encountered Maria Sabina, went to Mexico, and brought back mushrooms to Harvard, where he was studying as a PhD student in psychology. And then together with Rambas here on the upper right, they together recognized the cognitive flexibility and the openness that psychedelics allow for, and realized that it could be a transformative medicine within psychiatry. And unfortunately, because of some negligent behavior, they were both fired from Harvard, and Ram Dass went on to kind of try to seek and achieve the psychedelic state through meditation, which is why I studied learning for early Baba. Timothy Leary more went the other route and kind of tried to dose everything fine. And this is Rav Zalman Dr. Shlomo you might recognize from Jewish Renewal. Here, quick mention, Nixon called Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America. Which is why he has Jewish of psychedelic use. And at that point, sort of Roman Griffiths took the torch at Johns Hopkins. He's a pharmacologist there, and he's led the way with his, especially with his 2006 paper. Different forms, naturally organic, fungal, or plant matter, and they can also be biochemically synthesized. Another term for them, which hasn't really caught on, is called entheogen, which basically means God generating or generating the divine within, and this refers to the mystical experience that can happen during the psychedelic experience. So what are some of the subjective psychological effects that occur under psychedelics? So in terms of perception, there's often intensification or distortion of perceptual input. And often there's simple hallucinatory effects where you can see kaleidoscopic colors, a lot of geometric shapes. And you can also find more complex hallucinations where people describe seeing vast landscapes of mountains and terrains or rivers and oceans, or themselves flying, like really, or as you saw in the video earlier, really intense experiences. And these can happen in many different perceptual fields, like visual, conceptual, and in the body, somatosensory. And there's also this phenomenon of synesthesia, where these different fields of perceptual awareness can become synthesized. So you can, hear color, see sound. There's also the emotional component of psychedelic use, where unconscious feelings are often brought up to the conscious level and intensified. And a broad range of emotions can be felt during the psychedelic experience, from positive euphoria and playfulness and bliss and joy, all the way to really negative guilt, shame, fear, terror, and really just expands your emotional range during the experience. In terms of the cognitive effects, people tend to think more laterally instead of linearly. And so they tend to think more creatively, more openness. There's this phenomenon of subject-object impermanence, where there's sort of this boundarylessness between the subject and their surroundings. So people can maybe feel one with the room, or feel one with the chair they're sitting in, or one with the sky. It's sort of a dissolution of boundaries, and similar to how there's a dissolution of the ego, the sense of self. Okay, so now that we understand how they work, what exactly are these substances? So there's three major classes. So one class is called tryptamines, which are often referred to as the classical psychedelics. And here you can see a number of them. In the upper right is actually the molecular structure of serotonin, which is a pretty critical neurotransmitter with role in mood and learning and a bunch of other functions. And it has this 4-tryptamine structure here. And you can see that other psychedelics like dimethyltryptamine has a similar core structure, but it's just slightly modified. And this is sort of the main theory as to how psychedelics work and alter neurological activity, is that they stimulate the same receptor that serotonin does, but in a different manner, and thereby cause these radical changes in consciousness. So there's, of these tryptamines, there's about 1,500 natural varieties, and there's many different research chemicals that are synthesized in labs, and they're very similar to the actual, like naturally occurring ones, but they essentially just have slight modifications so that they don't, they can skirt sort of legal scheduling. So here is the core one that's being studied for depression, which is psilocybin. Here's that molecular structure. Once it is metabolized by the body, it enters the brain as psilocin, a slightly modified form. And this is the form that it occurs naturally in these psilocybin mushrooms, but the way that it's administered in studies is in synthetic fashion. This is, what do you say? By what, synthetic? Meaning naturally they occur in mushrooms. So if you're to go pick them in certain areas, like in Mexico, you could find them. But like when, the original person, Ben, who was in the study, he didn't take literal natural mushrooms. He took one that was synthesized in a lab that took out all the other components of the mushroom and just this critical molecule, psilocybin. Okay, yeah, let me know if there's anything else that's unclear. So LSD, lysergic acid ethylamide, you might be familiar with. Has a more complex structure. It's synthesized in a lab, but it's derived from natural products like ergot mold. It's a longer experience than psilocybin. Psilocybin is about 4 to 6 hours. LSD can be between 8 to 10 hours. It's an intense experience, but it is said to enhance creativity. There's a couple Nobel laureates that attribute their innovations to their experiences on LSD. Francis Crick with the double helix of the DNA molecule, and Perry Mullis with his invention of PCR. So it's a definitely very powerful psychedelic. Here you see dimethyltryptamine, which can be found in tree bark, fruit, and leaves. This is the molecular structure, and it can either be inhaled. This can be inhaled directly, or it can be drunk, vine, and leaf, found in the Amazon. And then this is how it looks as almost like a tea. So that contains DMT as well as some other molecules to help be absorbed better. And this is said to be one of the most potent psychedelics, and it's used in healing rituals by these Amerindian tribes in South America. It's called 5-methoxy-DMT. So this structure here is a methoxy group. It comes from the Bufo alvarius toad. It comes from its venom, and this launches the side out where all perception seems to stop. This is actually being looked at more in terms of its clinical applications because it's only a 10-minute experience. And so, being able to have more patients come through the clinic as opposed to the psilocybin 4 to 6 hour treatment, that's sort of the advantage of it there. So here are phenethylamines, which are another class of psychedelics. You may be familiar with MDMA, which is a slight modification of amphetamines, and they're all modified amphetamines, even though amphetamine itself is not considered a psychedelic. MDMA is also known as love drug or ecstasy. It really opens up your heart and helps you relate to others and express your emotions without any inhibition. And it's the leading candidate for post-traumatic stress disorder in terms of its how far it is in clinical trials. MAPS organization just finished phase 3, and it will probably be approved by the FDA in the coming year. There's also mescaline, which is a naturally occurring one. If you're familiar with Aldous Huxley, this is what he talks about in The Doors of Perception. He talks about his own experience with this mescaline derived from the cactus. Okay, last but not least, we have dissociatives, which is our almost like pseudo psychedelics. So if you've ever been to the dentist, you probably take a nitrous oxide. And I'm not sure what that is. 1 second.
Time now.
We're still on.
Is my screen still on?
We're still on over here.
Okay, I'll just minimize.
There we go. Keep logging. So.
That's still on. It's all the same. If you log it, doesn't matter.
Thank you. We'll let James do that. If I log out, you keep it on. You kidding? Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it'd be great. It's a very nuanced question, because where is this? I mean, psychedelics are pretty broad. There's many different forms of it. So psilocybin within the United States is decriminalized in Oregon, in Colorado, and Washington, D.C. There's actually a bill that's going to be put before the legislature in Illinois. It's going to try to decriminalize it in Illinois. Remember, decriminalize is not the same thing as legal, but it
What is it used for, that specific? Just mentioned psilocybin. What is that one used for?
a variety of indications. I'm gonna have a slide later, but basically, it's used for a lot of conditions that are rooted in cognitive inflexibility and rigidity of thought. And so things like OCD, things like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, substance use disorders, and specifically anxiety that's really effective for cancer patients that are near death, to help them with their existential distress. So it's very effective for that as well.
Describe this eventually. What sort of doctor?
A psychiatrist. But it won't necessarily have to be administered by one. It really depends if you're going to be doing it for a specific medical condition versus doing it as a healthy person. Like in Oregon, you can take psilocybin as a healthy person without it being prescribed for a specific indication. What is that?
It's a healthy person in recreation.
No, it would be under the care of a therapist, but it just doesn't need to be prescribed by a psychiatrist.
People do take it recreationally.
Like any drug.
Yeah.
You
You
gonna
got
talk
your
about
hands.
small doses of psychedelics that they're giving people like each day, you give yourself a small dose.
That's not something people give to other people. It's more people do it themselves. But I won't address that. You can ask me about it if you want.
Okay.
We get down to Zoom,
Yeah, we're good.
so you can see.
Uncle C, yeah,
Um,
we're back.
What are you doing?
A little water. Okay. So was talking about dissociatives, which are form of pseudo-psychedelics. You know, at an anesthetic dose, like you would have in the dentist, they're completely unconscious, but at some anesthetic doses, they can induce something that's similar to the psychedelic experience. And that's what ketamine has been approved for in terms of depression. It's the only psychedelic that's approved for clinical indication as of now. You may have seen ketamine clinics popping up, they're becoming very popular. Okay, so now that I've gone through all the different aspects of what psychedelics are, and hopefully have that understanding, I would like to talk about the healing capacity of psychedelics as well as its clinical applications. So the set and setting are critical parts of the psychedelic experience when done in a clinical environment, right? In scientific experiments, you try to control all the variables, you have the least variables possible. And the set and setting have a set refers to the mindset that one brings into the actual experience, and the setting is the physical environment they're surrounded by while they have the experience. And so this is really critical to the psychedelic experience itself, because what happens in the psychedelic experience is that your perception, or your sensory input that you're perceiving is either augmented or altered in some fashion. And so what is happening in your external and internal environment has a significant effect on the nature of the actual experience. So there's no, if you take psychedelic today and then again a month later, you're not going to have the exact same experience because the set and setting are different. And so there's sort of 3 stages to the clinical application of something like psilocybin. And so here I'm borrowing from the Yale psilocybin guide. Beforehand, you have a screening process where you see if the patient actually would fit well in the study. You have a preparatory process where you go over the expectations for the experience and what sort of mental health struggles the patient would like to work on. And then during the actual administration of the drug, as you can see a picture of what that's happening there, it's not done in a normal clinical setting. It's done in a place that's almost like a living room, where the patient sits on a couch, they're given a blanket, eye mask, shades, are given a playlist specifically to listen to, and they're really supported by the guides directed to go inwards. And you saw the nature of one such experience earlier. Now, afterwards, there's this integration process, which is really critical for the effects to be long lasting, where the therapist will go over the experience and discuss it with the patient so that they can process what they've experienced and integrate it into their everyday life. And then there's some follow-up period where they follow up with the patients for 3, 6 months, a year, to see how their well-being has changed, how their symptoms of whatever medical indication has changed. And so, yeah, those are the 3 stages: before, during, and after.
How long would that take?
How long would what take?
The entire experience.
Well, I mean, the actual dosing session is a single day, right? 6 hours. Preparation is probably a month or 2. Follow-up, like I said, is 3 months, 6 months, a year, something like that.
So the dosage being never taken more than 1.
That's not necessarily the case. Different research studies have different protocols. So the one with the OCD, that was one session, but most of them are like 2 to 4.
You know,
And
the success rate. The success rate of curing OCD.
so for half the patients, the completely in remission. For another third of the patients, their symptoms were significantly reduced. Basically, the way that OCD is measured is through something called the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale. So you measure the reduction in symptoms based on how much lower they score on that scale.
And that's from 1 session.
Yeah, of 25 milligrams of psilocybin. Yeah.
32% significant reduction, 50%.
Mhm. No effect, but I mean, something that's like the standard of care right now, which is SSRIs, they only work for about 50% of people as well, and they don't have the same reduction in terms of the Y box score.
How far out? I mean, they done study 5 years later.
This study was conducted a year ago.
A year ago, so we don't know if it's
How long lasting? That's like the next sort of stage, is to understand how frequently one would need a maintenance dose. You know, that's sort of the next stage of studies for sure. But thank you for the question. So psilocybin, like I said, is used for obsessive compulsive disorder, but for many other conditions that are rooted in a rigidity of thought and sort of sticking into one's habits and an inflexibility in changing their perception. And so that's why it's effective for these variety of conditions, because they have that feature in common. So like I said, her question earlier, it's being used for anxiety, depression, OCD, eating disorder, substance use, and specifically anxiety around existential distress in end-of-life situations. Here's a sort of,
I can ask a question, sorry.
sure.
Forgive me.
don't know, go ahead.
Can you explain to me like what I'm like the video at the beginning, right? So we had this guy who had a significant issue with OCD.
Mhm.
How do you understand what happened? Like he went deep into his mind, into his soul, whatever it is, killed something, and then came back to life. What happened? How did his body or how did his mind know to heal itself? Or was there a guide that encouraged that action to happen? Can you, do you have an insight into how that works or how one should go about that? Was it a natural thing?
I haven't talked to this individual, so I can't say exactly like the nature of what happened phenomenologically. But what I can say generally is that this study was done with minimal therapist intervention. So they didn't direct him to do any of these things during that experience. And these things tend to sort of play out naturally, where sort of phobias or negative emotions that you've been suppressing are brought to the fore. And then you can process them in a new way. It's almost like they call it beginner's mind, right? As an adult, we tend to have very fixed beliefs, and that's sort of what gets entrenched in the OCD or depression. And so this allows you to, re-examine your core beliefs from a fresh perspective and to change how you perceive them.
So my understanding is that the human naturally heals itself.
Yeah.
Like given the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Did the preparation have anything to do with that? What they talked about, what they brought to their mind?
I would probably assume so. Yeah, I think they try not to, influence them too much to say that like, this is what you're going to experience. They try to leave it very open, but they also don't want them to, go into it cold. So they want to tell them like things to generally expect. But the general thing that they tell them to do is to go inwards. That's why they have the eye mask, to shut out external stimuli and to go within themselves and to let what happens play out naturally. Like that's what they direct them. They don't say like work on X, Y, and Z. I don't know if I should do it at the end or.
Where are we in?
We're about halfway.
Okay, so
yeah.
Other than like personal account, like how people feel after these, like looking like for the neural pathways change in the brain. Typically.
Yeah, so there's someone named Robert Card Harris. He's at UCSF, and he's kind of the foremost scientist who's done these types of studies. And basically, in all these clinical trials, they do what are called EEG measurements, electroencephalography, as well as functional magnetic resonance imaging. And they do it before and after. And they observe how functional connectivity changes. And what they found mostly is that specifically in the default mode network, there's significant change in functional connectivity. And with people with OCD, there's this idea of it's called error-related negativity. And that significantly changes as well. So yeah, those metrics are shown, but like there's no definitive consensus as to like what happens. They thought it was just the 5-HT2A receptor that these psychedelics stimulate, but then they found now that it's another receptor. So like the science definitely isn't settled on. I know you had a question, but we do it at the end or? Okay, good. Yes, I think I mentioned in this slide where the various psychedelics are in terms of their FDA trials. As you see here, MDMA for PTSD is furthest along. MAPS just finished. MAPS stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Science, run by actually a Jewish fellow named Rick Doblin. And it just finished phase 3 and will likely be approved by the FDA early next year. And there's 2 companies, Usona and Compass, that just finished stage 2 for psilocybin for depression. So now they're about to start phase 3, and that will likely take 3 to 5 years before it can be approved. So now it's the mystical experience and its relationship.
What's the little part? What's this proof that it's gonna be legal for all of us to use it?
again, asking for Mordechai, can you repeat the question? For those-
Well, I mean,
Just repeat the question, please.
they can hear it. They can hear
If
I
a
guess.
patient needs it,
her. Oh.
it's approved by the FDA, does it matter if you live in Illinois, in North Carolina, or in Oregon? If it's approved, then is it approved for medical use throughout the nation?
So, I mean, this is a nuance, so let me repeat the question for the people on Zoom. She's asking whether or not once it's approved, does that mean you can have readily available access for everybody? And so the substance that I was talking about was MDMA, and that will only be approved for people with diagnosed with PTSD. So if you have PTSD and a clinician that you're seeing is licensed to administer it, then he can administer it to you.
2 minutes.
Yes, throughout the US, the FDA is a federal institution. But if psilocybin is decriminalized in Illinois, then it would be completely okay to possess psilocybin. You could not be arrested for that. Yeah, so if you have a psychotic disorder like bipolar or schizophrenia specifically, it's generally not recommended. It can induce psychosis. And also if you're on high doses of SSRIs, generally, I mean, it's not necessarily contraindicated, but definitely in the studies, they taper you off before having you do psilocybin. Okay. Good. Okay. So now, the criticality of the mystical experience to the healing process. So here in this paper, they reviewed about 12 studies, and the majority of them, 10 of them showed that the higher a person scored on what's called the mystical experience questionnaire, like the degree to which their psychedelic session was mystical in nature, the higher their clinical improvement was. So what is precisely the mystical experience that is induced by psychedelics? So there's 4 dimensions of the mystical experience questionnaire here. You have mysticism, which has 4 categories of this internal unity, feeling at one with yourself, of external unity, feeling at one with everything around you. There's a noetic quality in this mystical experience where you feel like you have deep insight that's deep in your body. And then you have the sacredness where you feel like this experience is transcendently spiritual. Then obviously there's enhancement of positive mood. People often transcend time and space. They feel like they're no longer contained in the present, past, or future. And then there's a sense of ineffability where the nature of the experience itself can't even be described in words. It's so like you try to describe it, but that sort of detracts from the actual experience because it's impossible to describe. It can only be experienced. And then, so these are the 4 dimensions of the mystical experience questionnaire. And when they go through the clinical trial, people are asked and scored in different questions with regards to these categories. And so the seminal paper of psychedelic renaissance was published in 2006 by Roland Griffiths, and it said psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. And so this was said to have spearheaded the psychedelic renaissance. And in this study, participants reported that this experience was one of the most significant experiences of their life, akin to the birth of a child or the death of a parent. And half the participants rated it, 2/3 of the participants rated it in the top 5 most spiritually significant experience of their life, and another third rated it as the most spiritually significant experience of their life. And then you have the religious leaders study, which was conducted from 2017, and they're about to publish it now, where they were trying to see, maybe just this mystical experience happens for the general public, but what about people who are steeped in mystical experience, like clergy? Do they experience the same thing in psychedelics? And so they found that clergy who had vast experience with psychedelics still rank, I meant the mysticism, I still rank their psilocybin experience as a uniquely transformative mystical experience. And here you can see our Zach comments. I'm going to talk more about later. He was one of the participants. So now that we've understood mysticism, how have psychedelics influenced Judaism? So critical question with that is, in mystical experiences were pretty formative in Jewish history, Mount Sinai, the manna. Were these experiences psychedelically inspired? So there's two schools of thought on this. We have this fellow here, Benny Shannon, who's a professor at Hebrew, a linguist and cognitive psychologist, who charted the phenomenology of the ayahuasca experience through his travels in Brazil or in South America. And essentially, he found striking similarities between the ayahuasca experience and what's reported in the Bible about Moses' experience at the bush. And these features include having an intense light, having a direct encounter with the divine, seeing creatures without faces, seeing, serpents are very common in ayahuasca visions, and obviously Moshe saw the staff turn into a snake. And so he contends that because he kind of puts this piecemeal theory together in his paper called Biblical Entheogen, a speculative hypothesis, because of certain ethnobotanical data and anthropological data, as well as these phenomenological elements. He says that so many clues present themselves with like the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, see people here into an intriguing unified whole. And he says that there is no smoking gun with it, and he leaves the reader to pass his or her judgment. And so I personally don't really see much evidence for this theory, just because most instances of prophecy within the Bible aren't accompanied by inhalation or ingestion of some psychedelic. Maybe for a couple of the experiences, you could say, Moshe inhaled the smoke and Mount Sinai was on fire, and that's what happened. But like, it's not like clearly in the text. So there's another school of thought, and this is Rick Strassman, who I mentioned before, who's also Jewish and led that first EMP study. And he basically says that the Hebrew Bible's model of prophecy is appealing because it comports well with the reports of the DMT volunteers. One sense of self is maintained, there's an external freestanding independent of the observer spiritual world, and one relates to the content of the experience rather than being dissolved into it. And so he contends essentially that prophets likely were able to methodically enter into a trance state through a process that they learned, in which DMT was produced at higher levels endogenously without having to take psychedelics from the outside. And this is what allowed them to receive overwhelming messages from the divine. And he kind of rejects Shannon's approach. And in the Talmudic era, there's no literal or actual mention of any psychedelic drugs, but interestingly, they do understand Torah and Torah learning itself as a drug. In this tractate in Yoma, it says that Torah which Moses placed, it's the Hebrew word is sam, shin mem, and drug is samach mem, right? So there's the hint there before the children of Israel that one merits it, it becomes a drug of life, and if one doesn't, it becomes a drug of death. And so basically they say that Torah is a mechanism to change one's consciousness, and so it's a drug in that nature. So now that I've described ancient history, I'll go more recently, that there's many Jews that were influenced by psychedelics in this last century during the second wave of the psychedelics. And one here is Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was initially a Chabad emissary for the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And while he was at Camp Ramah in New England, he went with Timothy Leary one day and had his first LSD experience. He called it an Aliyah's Neshama. And that completely changed the trajectory of his whole life in Jewish practice, which I'll get to more in a bit. But Rabbi Arthur Green here wrote about his experiences under the pseudonym Disclosure, and they communicated greatly about it. And then obviously there's Ramdas, who wasn't really a Jewish spiritual figure, but he did bring Eastern mysticism to a lot of Jews. So what is the role of psychedelics in Judaism today? So I think there's two main things that psychedelics have the capacity to do within Jewish society. One is healing intergenerational trauma, which is obviously very prevalent in Jews, given our persecution throughout history. And two is to reignite the spiritual core at the root of our religious practice. And so here you see this person, Yechiel Ben-Nur, who survived Auschwitz. He testified at the Eichmann trial, and he had concentration camp syndrome. And in 1976, this Dutch professor, Hans Bastiaans, treated him with LSD psychotherapy, and that account is recorded in Shinigi. So that's the first accounting of intergenerational Jewish trauma being treated by psychedelics. Now, in the present day, the leading expert on trauma and psychedelics is probably Rachel Yehuda, who's also Jewish, and she's a professor of psychiatry at Mount Sinai. And here you'll see that she describes how psychedelics have the capacity to heal trauma. And she says, if you're put in the exact right state, where you're not afraid of your emotional reactions or your memories, you have maximum interpersonal trust, a minimum self-blame, or guilt, or any of those things. This is a state that is perfect, that is a perfect place to start processing very difficult, traumatic memories and really catalyzing a therapeutic process. And so that, she's really leading that effort of healing intergenerational trauma as for the Jewish people. And so now to the other role that psychedelics can play in reigniting our spiritual core, I think we can learn from Reb Zalman, who described the Western religious practice as over-verbalized and under-experienced. I don't know if any of you can relate to that. So he describes his own experience with psychedelics in the middle. He says it was a very wonderful journey. The wonderful thing about psychedelics was the mind move that occurred, the recognition of the fluidity of consciousness. My reality maps were no longer absolute. So the experience only opens you up to greater vision. When you have the vision, you have a burden to carry that vision out. In other words, it makes demands on you. In those years, I felt that it was important to have a psychedelic experience at least twice a year, once before Yom Kippur and once before Passover, to revisit that place and check out what was happening there. So, inspired by his own psychedelic experiences, he started the Jewish Renewal Movement, which its aim was to reignite spiritual practices into the Jewish religious experience. And it definitely influenced many Jews who would have been otherwise been unaffiliated and helped them connect to Jewish spiritual practice. So how about today? Currently, as you see there on the upper right, this is Rabbi Zach Kamenetz. He was one of the clergy that participated in Johns Hopkins Religious Leader Study. And that experience, because there was no Jewish container to support his experience, everything was either Christian or Buddhist, he felt like his religious identity wasn't catered to in the actual experience. And so he started this organization called Shefa, which has a mission to create powerful pathways to the heart of Jewish wisdom and community inspired by the contemporary psychedelic renaissance. And so what he aims to do is create a framework for the preparatory process and the integration process that incorporate Jewish, Kabbalistic, and Hasidic practices. And so the notion of setting goes all the way back to the Mishnah, the idea of kabbara and kava. And there are techniques from Hasidic and Kabbalistic ecstatic traditions that people use to prepare. There's mantra practices, there's music that evokes it, there's blessings that we can do, and he has done this to support people's preparatory process. And then there's obviously the integration process afterwards, which there's Vodou, there's sort of imagery meditations, there's chanting Sukkim, there's composing your own Jewish poetry. There's a lot you can do with Jewish traditional knowledge to support the psychedelic experience. So that basically concludes my talk. The core ideas that I'd like you to walk away with today, that I hope I communicated well, are that psychedelics are a class of molecules that induce altered states of consciousness, which users often describe as one of the most spiritual experiences of their life. Second, psychedelic assisted therapy shows strong promise to revolutionize how psychiatric medicine is practiced for a wide variety of mental health conditions. Third, psychedelics often induce mystical experience that include a sense of boundarylessness, transcending time and space, and a complete dissolution of the ego. And lastly, mystical experience played a formative role in Judaism that has had significant ripple effects throughout Jewish history. Psychedelics greatly influenced the spiritual practice of Judaism in the 20th century, and they present a unique opportunity to help Jews heal from intergenerational trauma, as well as a framework through which we can reignite our spiritual core. Here is just something I think I already basically mentioned it based on the question, but in terms of the decriminalization of psilocybin, if you're curious about the bill that's going to be passed in legislature in Illinois, you can look up this organization called MPO Illinois. They sponsored the legislation. Yeah, I'd just like to acknowledge Rabbi Gotti and Eve for inviting me to talk, and also Rabbi Zach for helping me prepare the talk a little bit. Should I stop the screen share? Or,
We ask questions.
yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you have something to add to the high holidays.
We're close friends who need an experience.
Firehouse.
Mordechai, can I ask you? Mordechai, can I ask another question? So we've heard people have had bad trips and good trips.
Mm-hmm.
And we've only heard in your talk about good trips.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit towards that with regards what's funny about that?
My mom made me smile.
What would define are there ways of avoiding a bad trip? Do you think that people are able to ensure that if they go with significant trauma of whatever it may have been, that they do not suffer a terrible trip and make things worse? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
I've done my research.
Yeah, I didn't intend to paint too rosy of a picture. There's definitely challenging experiences that people can have. And so I think the core element to support that is doing it in the right setting with the right facilitator. And so you want to do it with someone who's very experienced, someone who's trained ideally, someone who probably has a psychotherapeutic background. You also want to do it in the right mindset. You don't want to come into it while you have many things on your mind, while you're stressed by work. You want to be able to set aside time for it where you're at peace, and you want to be able to do it in an environment that is peaceful itself. Notwithstanding, that doesn't mean you'll always avoid a difficult experience. But oftentimes the difficult experience that you go through can't be core to the healing process. And so as long as you're supported through that difficult experience, then it's not going to negatively damage you in the long term. I mean, hopefully, but that would be the best way to mitigate that risk.
Or by insurance.
Are there any studies about the pieces of it with long-term damage?
But I do know that there was a study that seemed to indicate that MDMA did long-term damage to mice brains, but then they found that that study was actually corrupted and they'd given the mice amphetamines instead of MDMA. So there is no evidence that MDMA causes long-term brain damage, and I don't think LSD does either. What about it?
Floating, all the people. What about
Different, that's a lot of it.
Yeah, that's one element of it. In the setting that they did it in was not ideal for sure. And I think a lot of our perception of it was skewed by propaganda. I think Nixon had a significant agenda to suppress the counterculture, and psychedelics were a mechanism to do that.
So the successful data that you're talking about, how big were those groups? Was it 2 people or 20,000?
So it depends which study. So like a phase 1 trial would probably be 10 to 15 people. Phase 2 is probably 30 to 40. Phase 3 is probably 100, 150 people.
So what I'm getting from this presentation, there are opportunities for these segments to improve people who have very severe OCD or stress disorder. That's one reason. Another use is recreational, you just wanna get them out of my experience.
Yeah.
And,
Oh.
and then the third use would be if you want to increase your spirituality. Try to connect to the shop.
Mhm.
Are those the three?
That's a good way to categorize it. I mean, I would say another one is maybe to connect commutally. You know, it's another thing. Can connect with your family. You know, MDMA said to be very good for couples. Well, I think it allows you, well, MDMA, for example, it allows you to express your emotions without any inhibitions and you feel a sense of true love for other individuals in a way that you wouldn't in a normal state. Uncle Greg,
Where does marijuana fit into your schema?
can you elaborate on that question?
Or is marijuana psychedelic according to your definition?
Can you repeat the
No.
question for the people online?
Can they still hear me?
Yeah.
No, marijuana is not. People say it's psychedelic-like. People say when you eat edible marijuana, it has more psychedelic-like properties because of the concentration, but it's technically not classified as a psychedelic. But it has medical efficacy for sure.
After these experiences, did the patients often remember the experience very clearly? Or is it something that you don't remember being?
You probably don't remember all elements of it. Something like a dissociative, like ketamine, is difficult to actually remember the details. But something like psilocybin, generally those are very, you know, you're very conscious when that's happening. The 5-methoxy experience with the toad venom is so quick and it's so intense that you don't really remember it, but it still has very therapeutic value.
In the video, remember?
Yeah, he remembered a lot of details. And that was psilocybin. Sophie.
You had shown the different waves of psychedelic use, starting with, when Western interest grew, there was the one individual who allowed some students in and exercise. And I'm just curious now that we're in this third wave global, like, global renaissance. How that approach towards like indigenous culture use is being approached. I mean, is it different now? Do you think that there's still, how are you sort of balancing like Western use of interest with?
I don't think there's a uniform way that people are doing it. I think some groups are being more conscious and respectful of it and are trying to incorporate indigenous practices into their own usage. It's very difficult to incorporate that into an actual study because it has to be very controlled. But there is a study done by the University of Wisconsin that's looking at how the container of an indigenous use affects the actual experience. But there are some groups that are not being respectful and are just sort of, you know, taking their medicine and becoming faux shamans, and you know, it's definitely a mixed bag.
So what medications is this gonna replace?
I don't know if it's necessarily going to replace any medications. I think that's probably based on, it's a very individualized answer. But I mean, something like SSRIs, where often it has a pretty mild effect, and but people still exhibit symptoms, but just a little dampened. That's one that it could replace. It could maybe replace some mood stabilizers, which are sometimes prescribed for PTSD, or benzodiazepines.
Antidepressants.
And yeah, SSRIs are antidepressants. But there's not like a one-to-one thing where like this is gonna replace that, you know. Yeah.
So like these things are coming out there now, like features. What would you say, like, is there a downside for somebody who's struggling with anxiety or depression? Like to go straight there, like, or do they need to, like, you say, it's from your experience, they need to like go through. Is there a downside going straight?
I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't give a prescriptive advice for, I think that would be a very case by case basis. I think if it doesn't work, if standard of care isn't working for someone, then this would be about like a viable alternative. I think if a patient requests this, it'd be a viable alternative. I think in general, the benefit of these interventions is that they don't have to be taken daily. It's not something you sort of stay on. It's, something that you can have an experience 1 or 2 times, maybe maintenance doses every few months or something. And so, it doesn't, it's not something that you feel is like a part of you all the time. That's one benefit of it. But whether or not, how you'd recommend it prescriptively, I think that's a case by case basis.
You know, a lot of people in mental illness take medication.
So that could
This
be
is
one
an
benefit.
option for them. Works for them.
Definitely. All right. Okay.
No more questions? I have one more. Do you
Doctor-
think,
Doctor-
Holocaust survivor? That experience.
So I need to read his book, but I think he had concentration camp syndrome. So I don't know exactly how many sessions he did, but he wrote a detailed description of it. It was a pretty harrowing experience, but he promoted it to the world. So I think he had a very positive transformation through it. I think it's deep PTSD from being in a concentration camp.
That's specific type of PTSD.
Yeah.
The role of psychedelics. Are you a psychiatrist or?
No.
Okay.
No, I do scientific research. I worked on this study that I was telling you about, the psilocybin for OCD. Not the one that person participated in, but the one in Arizona. And in the fall, I'll be doing more laboratory work where we're going to be culturing what are called brain organoids. These are synthetic brains in a petri dish. And you grow them to the point where they can mimic human brains to some degree. And then you're going to introduce psychedelics into that environment and observe sort of the genomic changes and transcriptomic changes and changes in inflammation. So more on the research side. Yeah.
Research.
You were an investor.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's so nice to have someone. Have a good night. Yeah.